Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel, Anglo Election Insights. We're continuing a video series previewing the upcoming Australian federal election, and today we're making a quick pit stop in the NT with two rather important electorates. As per usual, we'll have a look over some quick history. In 2001, the Northern Territory, which was then a single electorate, got split into two. Solomon contains basically the metropolitan part of the Northern Territory based around Darwin and the satellite town of Palmerston, and Lingiari basically has everything else, including Alice Springs, Catherine, Tennant Creek, and all of the remote and pastoral land, as well as the islands and that sort of far northern part of the territory. And we can see that upon its creation, Solomon was a little bit more solid for the Liberals, or the Country Liberal Party, CLP, as they're known up there, whereas Lingiari was held consistently by Labor MP Warren Snowden, who had a significant personal following. However, come 2016, Luke Gosling was able to win Solomon for Labor, and he's created quite a solid buffer of about 10%, whereas Lingiari is actually tending the other way and becoming quite close. So one big data point that we have coming into this next federal election is the territory election, which was held earlier this year. It was quite a significant result after Labor comfortably held on to government in 2020. We can see that while their rural and remote vote seems to have anything stayed fairly stable, they've picked up a seat here daily. Comfortably held on to these two and this one here, and in fact they've increased their margins, but pretty much everywhere else, especially in Darwin and Palmerston, the CLP absolutely stormed home and flipped heaps and heaps of seats, including in northern Darwin, which is very much where Labor's stronghold has been since 2001 when they began dominating NT politics. So a really big result for the NT there that, if replicated, would absolutely flip both seats federally. So yeah, swings of between 10 and 25% across Darwin and Palmerston, but the Labor vote obviously holding up more outside of those areas. One big factor in this election was the low turnout. It was about 6.5 points down on the prior territory election. Perhaps it's the AC's fault. Maybe their mobile booths didn't get around properly because a lot of it was in the remote communities, that low turnout. But perhaps it was also a result of voter fatigue and apathy following the voice referendum result, or perhaps that temporary spike in enrolments prior to the voice referendum has pushed up the enrolment figures, but a lot of those people have no intention of actually voting at the territory or federal level. One caveat that we must mention is that state and territory results certainly don't always point to what's going to happen federally. Australian politics is littered with examples of that. A good one is Queensland 2004, where Labor had a pretty shocking result federally, but easily won the state election there that year. So keep that in mind. Moving on, we'll have a look at the two seats in a little bit more detail. So Solomon, this is the seat that covers Darwin and Palmerston, the more metropolitan of the seats. And as we said before, in the territory election, huge swings against the Labor Party. Something else we noticed was the Greens vote. What not everyone would know about Darwin is that there's actually, in terms of the rest of Australia, they're actually quite high in terms of income levels and educational attainment. So the Green vote certainly benefits from that. But one thing we did notice in both 2022 and particularly 2024 was the preferences. There was a lot of leakage to the Country Liberals, particularly in the territory election, and that actually enabled them to steal a couple of seats that they otherwise might not have gotten. So there could be an interesting situation where the Country Liberals increase their primary vote by quite a lot, mostly at the expense of both Labor and the right-wing minor parties. And also potentially the Greens take a bit more vote off Labor. That might allow the country Liberals to get into first place, and then if there's enough preference leakage from the Greens to the Liberals, that could create a really tight result on election night. So definitely one to keep an eye on. Lingiari, obviously the rest of the territory. There was quite a significant swing of about 4.5% to the country Liberals against the national trend in 2022. A lot of that would probably have to do with the retirement of Warren Snowden, who had quite a significant personal following, and he'd held the seat for a long, long time, going back to the days of old Parliament House, in fact. But the key here is going to be, is this representing a trend, or will the Labour member receive enough of a sophomore swing to balance out the tailwind that the coalition has in terms of the national environment? But in a place like Lingiari, the national environment probably isn't as strong a factor as it would be in a different part of Australia. It very much has its own politics and its own swings and its own movements. But there does seem to be evidence of a trend towards the CLP here, and that margin isn't leaving Labor with a lot to play with. Not much polling in the NT, I'm afraid. There was a Redbridge poll from late 2023 where they polled both territory and federal voting intention. The territory result was fairly close to what Redbridge published in terms of the territory voting intention, and the federal results from that poll were quite similar. So we have at least one data point that suggests that there's anger at both the then sitting ALP territory government as well as the sitting federal government. And the other data point we have here is that both seats comfortably voted no in the voice referendum. MRP does cover the NT as well, but with such sort of diversity of demographics and just the sort of insular nature of NT politics and its sort of distance from the rest of Australia and the population of Australia, it might not necessarily be the best measure of voting intention, but nonetheless it is showing over time that the LNP is strengthening their position, or the CLP I should say, strengthening their position in Lingiari, but interestingly going nowhere in Solomon. We can see that Green vote very stable, and that country Liberal vote stuck in the late 20s, which would make for a pretty easy Labor retain. As for my predictions, I think Lingiari flips. I don't think turnout is likely to improve, which will impact Labor's margins in the more remote and pastoral areas. Obviously, we've got the national environment too, and I'm not sure that the new MP is going to have a personal following anywhere near the magnitude of what Warren Snowden had, and I don't think she's going to be able to survive that sort of a swing. Having said that, despite what that Redbridge poll said, I don't think the swing will be anywhere near what it was in the territory election. As for Solomon, I think there will be a much bigger swing in Solomon, but it probably won't be enough to overturn that 10% Labor margin. Here, the incumbency factor that Gosling has built up as the Labor member, I think, works in his favour, and the higher Green vote, while we theorise that perhaps that could be of benefit to the CLP, perhaps preference discipline will be a little bit better this time round. That's all for today's video, just a quick one on the NT. Next up, we'll be heading east to where most of the main battlegrounds are. So stay tuned, please subscribe to the channel, keep an eye out for future videos, and share the videos with your friends, as well as commenting your thoughts below. Cheers.